All right, so we're going to be looking at some Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 wiring, do a little overview of Article 725. So the title for Article 725 is Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 Remote Control, Signaling, and Power Limited Circuits, which in and of itself is quite the mouthful. So I'd like to go over the scope of the article first because I think there's a couple good takeaways from that. So the scope says this article covers remote control, signaling, and power limited circuits that are not an integral part of a device or of utilization equipment. So first takeaway is that latter part, they're not part of a device or of utilization equipment. So this is our wiring. This is field wiring. It's not wiring that you'll find inside of an appliance or a piece of equipment that you're hooking up. This is the wiring that we are doing. And the other takeaway that I'd like to go over with this is really if you're in a place where you're wondering, am I going to Article 725? Am I dealing with this? Well, the answer really falls in these circuits, or not these circuits, but these definitions here. So ask yourself, am I dealing with a remote control circuit, a signaling circuit, or a power limited circuit? Well, what are those? The answer is a remote control circuit is basically just a circuit that controls another circuit. So, for example, a motor control cabinet. You have circuits in there that are controlling ultimately another circuit that is feeding the motor. Signaling circuit provides an output or a signal. So, for example, a doorbell is a type of signaling circuit. And then finally, power limited circuits are circuits that are limited to generally both of their voltage and their total VA is limited to prevent electric shock or fire hazards. So what 725 does is it takes these types of circuits and it actually breaks them down into different classifications. So we have class 1, 2, and 3 wiring. And 725 takes class 1 and kind of sets it on its own. It's its own thing. And then classes 2 and 3, really for all intents and purposes, are lumped together and treated the same throughout the code book. So they are different, but they're for the most part treated the same. And so here we have another moment where you might be wondering, oh, am I dealing with class 1, 2, or 3? I don't really know. So the best way to figure that out is really to look at your power source. So if you're wondering, oh, is this class 2 wiring? Well, look at your power source. If you have a class 2 power source, then yes, it's class 2 wiring. If you have a class 1 power source, class 1 wiring, class 3 power source, class 3 wiring. So that's really where you're going to be able to figure out what more or less you're dealing with. And your class 2 and class 3 power sources should be marked to indicate that they are class 2 or class 3 power sources. So you should be able to turn to it and figure it out. But the code book also does offer some guidelines as to what realm a class 2 power source falls in. It should be less than 100 VA and 30 volts or less and less than 5 milliamps of current. So you should have some guidelines to work with, but really your power sources should be marked to indicate what they are. And we'll get to that a little bit later as well. So looking at class 1 circuits, the code takes class 1 circuits and it separates them into two groups. You have your non-power limited and your power limited. And this is part of what sets class 1 apart from the other two classes because with class 2 and 3 wiring, everything is power limited. Class 1 is the only one that actually has a non-power limited wiring. So, and really with class 1 wiring, that is going to be your most common. You're really going to be doing more non-power limited wiring than you are going to be touching power limited at all. So your class 1 non-power limited circuits are going to be, one of the best examples that I could come up with for it is motor controls. You have generally your control circuits controlling your motor. You have your signaling circuits with pilot lights or buzzers, and these all are generally going to operate at 120 volts or greater. So great example of non-power limited class 1 circuits. On the other hand, I was kind of hard pressed to find good examples of power limited class 1 circuits. The best example that I could find was motorized window blinds, which I guess are at least sometimes power limited class 1 circuits, but it's not something that we will largely be doing or touching on. So some requirements with class 1 circuits, what you'll find for the most part with non-power limited class 1 circuits is that it's going to be very familiar wiring. It's going to be all chapter 3 wiring method, 600 volt insulation. Conductor sizing is for the most part the same as what we're used to. So with our class 1 circuits, it's all going to be the most familiar type of wiring with a couple additional nuances throughout Article 725, but it's all for the most part the same as what we're used to. So moving on to some class 2 and class 3 wiring, and starting off with, we're going to look at some power sources. So you can see the word listed coming up a lot, and so really your class 2 and class 3 power sources, like I mentioned, should be marked. So I actually went around my house just to see what I could find in terms of class 2 power sources, and I actually found this little wall adapter. And if I can get the camera to focus, I don't know if I'm going to be able to, but if I could get the camera to focus, you guys would be able to see here in bold print it says class 2 power supply. So if I could get it to focus, you would hopefully be able to read that. So that was just one example of a household item that I found I had a class 2 power supply on it. Another really common example is your everyday doorbell transformer is going to be a class 2 power supply, and it should actually be marked on it, class 2 power supply. And you can see it if you start looking for it, you'll see it more and more often. Another one is garage door openers. If you look on the garage door opener where your low voltage wires are coming on, it'll say class 2 power supply. So again, that is really what you're going to be looking at if you're wondering what kind of wiring you're dealing with. If you're in class 2 or class 3, look at your power supply. It should say on there. So when it comes to your circuit requirements here, a couple additional nuances are added, a little bit changes. So you do have the option to continue to use chapter 3 wiring methods, but you don't have to, and that's maybe where class 2 or 3 is nice, is we have the option to use a little bit less stringent rules when it comes to the cabling. And then in addition to that, 725 doesn't require a box for splices, and this is where you'll see a lot of low voltage wires just all spliced about in the air, no box, no consideration. It's because Article 725 doesn't require it for class 2 and class 3, I think. Class 3 is a little bit different. Then the other thing is that when it comes to class 2 and class 3 wiring, we have to keep things separate, and that's where that starts to shine through. There are some exceptions that allow us to run cables and wires along with electric light and power conductors, but for the most part, things need to start being kept separate. And then we can see as it continues, one of the more interesting ones is 725.143. Cables are not permitted to be strapped, taped, or attached to the exterior of a raceway as means of support. So what this boils down to is, besides a few exceptions, say theoretically if you're running wires for a garage door opener, you can't tape them to a conduit that's nearby. You have to actually support them independently. So it's something that I've seen a few times. I'm sure you guys have too. And then finally, to wrap things up, of course, we are still in the 2017 code cycle, but I thought there were some interesting changes being made in 2023. So depending on how Wisconsin decides to adopt it, we might see these things coming soon. So we'll have several new articles. First off, we're going to have Article 722 is going to be covering the cables for power limited circuits. So cabling will be in its own section now. And then they've finally actually decided to separate Class 1 from Class 2 and 3. So Class 1 will now reside in its own article in 724. Class 2 and 3 will reside still in 725, and then we are adding a new class. We will have a Class 4 wiring, and that will be found in Article 726. So some interesting changes to be made, and that is my last slide. So a lot to go over in such a short amount of time, and I feel like I barely even touched the surface of it. So lots to cover there.